Imagine the United States government stepping in to offer car insurance. But instead of covering like a fender bender on your daily commute, they're insuring massive, multi-million-dollar ocean-faring cargo ships.
Right, and instead of protecting against hail damage or whatever, they are literally insuring against global maritime warfare.
Exactly. I mean, it sounds like the plot of a geopolitical thriller, right?
It really does, yeah. But it's actually a very real, very complex financial maneuver that's happening right now, and it completely changes how we need to look at the global economy.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking you inside the White House press briefing room. Usually, that room is a chaotic blur of political theater, reporters shouting over each other.
Constant shouting.
Right, but we're zeroing in on a very specific moment today. It's the tax day briefing from April 16, 2026. Because underneath all the usual back and forth, this briefing quietly revealed exactly how the administration is attempting to, well, basically rewire the American economy and reshape global security.
Yeah, it was a really dense session.
It was. So our mission today is to cut through the rhetoric and extract the hard facts that are actively impacting your wallet, your gas tank, and the global supply chain.
And to really grasp what happened in that room, you have to look at who was actually standing at the podium. I mean, it wasn't just the press secretary handling the daily questions.
Right.
You had the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and the Small Business Administrator, Kelly Loeffler, and they were there to deliver this highly coordinated message about domestic wealth while simultaneously navigating questions about a world that is essentially on fire.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with the domestic side of the equation, the money directly in your pocket. Because on tax day 2026, the administration came out swinging. They were promoting what they call the working families tax cuts.
Right.
And listening to the briefing, they are framing this as a massive, sweeping success.
Right.
But what do the actual numbers look like on the ground?
Well, the scale is undeniably massive. The Treasury Secretary reported that more than 53 million filers claimed at least one of these new signature tax cuts. Wow. Yeah, to put that in perspective for you, we are talking about roughly a third of all individual tax returns filed in the U.S.
A third? That's huge.
It is. And the bottom line for the average taxpayer utilizing these provisions, it's a refund of more than $3,400.
See, that is a number that absolutely demands attention. Getting a $3,400 check is a tangible shift for a household budget. But looking through the breakdown of these cuts, I noticed we aren't just talking about a blanket, across-the-board adjustment to the standard deduction.
Ooh, not at all.
They highlighted really highly specific exemptions.
Exactly. And this is where the policy moves away from basic accounting and enters the realm of behavioral economics. They are using the tax code to incentivize very specific types of economic participation.
Right, like trying to get people to act a certain way.
Yes. For example, over 6 million filers claimed the no tax on tips exemption. For those workers, that averaged out to a $7,100 deduction.
Yeah.
And then you have over 25 million filers claiming no tax on overtime, which averaged a $3,100 deduction.
So it's not just the government handing money back. It's the government essentially saying, we will financially reward you for behaving in a certain way.
Precisely. Because if you remove the tax burden on overtime pay, you are fundamentally changing the math for a wage worker. You're removing the penalty of, being bumped into a higher tax bracket just because you work a 50-hour week instead of a 40-hour week.
Which is a huge complaint for a lot of hourly workers.
Absolutely. And Administrator Loeffler actually used this example of a CNC machinist in Pennsylvania who is routinely taking extra shifts now. The administration is explicitly framing this as their solution to labor shortages. Like, if you need more output, you heavily incentivize the labor force you already have to just work longer hours.
That makes sense. There was another provision in there that caught my eye, too. There are enhanced deductions for seniors, which, makes sense politically and practically. But there's also a targeted exemption where you don't pay tax on the interest for an auto loan, provided you bought an American-made car.
Yeah, that is a textbook example of using consumer tax policy to drive an industrial strategy. You are artificially lowering the lifetime cost of a vehicle to steer consumer capital directly into domestic manufacturing.
And speaking of domestic manufacturing, Administrator Loeffler talked heavily about what she called 100% expensing for equipment and expansion. She mentioned this manufacturing plant in rural Georgia that went from running one shift a week to up to 6 days a week because of this.
Right.
Can you break down what 100% expensing actually means for a business? Because, it sounds like financial jargon, but Clearly, it's moving the needle.
It really is. It's a massive deal for capital-intensive businesses. So under normal tax rules, if a business buys a $1 million piece of heavy machinery, the IRS doesn't let them deduct that entire $1 million from their taxes in year one.
Oh, right. They have to spread it out.
Exactly. They have to depreciate it, meaning they deduct a small portion of that cost over, say, 10 years.
Which totally ties up their cash.
It does. It slows down their ability to reinvest. But with 100% expensing, the business gets to deduct the entire $1 million from their taxable income the exact moment they buy the machine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it frees up an enormous amount of immediate cash flow. So that factory in Georgia can buy a new assembly line, wipe out their tax liability for the year, and use the saved cash to immediately hire workers to run that line 6 days a week. It's a very deliberate strategy to rapidly onshore manufacturing and build industrial capacity.
That makes total sense now. And, speaking of building capacity, there was a completely different financial initiative discussed that felt almost foundational. They called them Trump accounts, formerly known as Form 48547.
Seed accounts.
Yeah, I was looking at the details. And 5 million families filed for these accounts for their children, with 1.2 million kids eligible for a $1,000 seed bonus.
This is a fascinating long-term play. It's essentially a federally backed financial literacy initiative. And when you combine these seed accounts with other policies they mentioned, like directing 529 savings accounts and Pell Grants toward trade schools instead of just, traditional four-year universities, you start to see a cohesive architecture.
It's like they're trying to build an industrial capital class from the youth up. Like, give them the seed money, direct the educational grants toward tangible trades, and then ensure their factories running 6 days a week, just waiting to hire them.
That is the exact narrative the administration is trying to construct. And it's important to look at this strictly from a messaging perspective, too. Whether you agree with the underlying economic theory or not, their rhetorical strategy in that briefing room was incredibly aggressive.
Oh, for sure.
They repeatedly contrasted their targeted relief for workers against the opposition, claiming that if the previous administration's policies had continued, Americans would have faced a $4 trillion tax hike and a 22% increase in tax rates.
Right. And we should pause here to remind you, the listener. We aren't taking sides here. We're just reporting the claims made in the room to help you understand the messaging strategy of the administration. But they are painting a picture of parallel prosperity, a narrative that says, we are rescuing the working class from an opposition that wants to heavily tax your overtime.
Exactly.
But here is where we hit the massive elephant in the room. Getting an extra $3,400 back in your taxes or seeing your factory run extra shifts feels great, but that extra wealth feels totally hollow if it is immediately drained the second you pull up to the gas station.
And that is exactly where the press corps pushed back. Because gas prices are the single most visible economic indicator for the average citizen. You can talk about 100% expensing all day, but if it costs $100 to fill up a minivan, the public feels poor.
Yeah, the Treasury Secretary was pressed incredibly hard on this. A reporter flat out asked when Americans might see gas back down to $3 a gallon. And he made a shockingly specific prediction.
He did.
He said he's optimistic that sometime between June 20th and September 20th of 2026, we will see gas with a 3 in front of it again.
Yes.
But to understand why gas is so high right now and why the Treasury Secretary thinks it'll drop by late summer, we have to look thousands of miles away from American shores.
What's fascinating here is that this is where a domestic tax briefing suddenly morphed into a masterclass on global economic warfare. The reason gas prices have spiked so violently is due to what the administration calls Operation Economic Fury.
Right.
The United States has instituted a unilateral physical blockade on all Iranian ports in the Arabian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman.
And they're enforcing this against vessels from all nations. Like, it isn't just a strong suggestion. It is a maximum pressure campaign.
It is a total chokehold, and it goes far beyond, naval destroyers blocking oil tankers. It is a severe financial squeeze.
Yeah.
The Treasury Secretary confirmed they are refusing to renew general licenses for both Russian and Iranian oil.
Okay, let's pause there for a second. What does refusing to renew a general license actually mean in the global oil trade?
So normally, when the U.S. sanctions a country's oil, the Treasury Department will issue what are called general licenses. Think of them as temporary permission slips.
Okay.
They essentially say to the market, we know this oil is sanctioned, but to prevent a massive global energy shortage, we will temporarily allow certain transactions to clear so the global market doesn't panic.
So revoking those licenses is the U.S. government tearing up the permission slips.
Exactly.
They're abruptly taking millions of barrels of sanctioned oil completely off the global market, which inherently spikes the price of every other barrel of oil out there.
Yes. And they are taking it a step further by openly threatening secondary sanctions on foreign banks. The secretary explicitly noted that 2 unnamed Chinese banks had received warning letters from the U.S. Treasury.
Wait, I need you to break this down.
Yeah.
How can the U.S. Treasury dictate what a bank in Beijing does with Iranian money? Like, how do secondary sanctions actually work?
The best way to understand secondary sanctions is to think of the global U.S. dollar system as an ultra-exclusive VIP club. The United States is the bouncer. China is a high-rolling guest. Iran is a patron who has been permanently banned from the premises. A secondary sanction is the bouncer walking up to the high roller and saying, "We can't stop you from talking to the banned patron out in the alley, but if we catch you doing it, you are never allowed back inside this club."
Man. And because the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency of the world, getting kicked out of the club means you essentially can't participate in global trade.
Exactly. The message to Beijing was blunt. If we prove Iranian money is flowing through your financial institutions, we will cut your banks off from the U.S. financial system. It is a high-wire geopolitical act, especially considering China was purchasing more than 90% of Iran's oil before this blockade began.
That is incredibly tense. But amidst all of this talk of blockades and sanctions, there was one financial detail that completely stopped me in my tracks. They casually mentioned a $40 billion U.S. reinsurance program for private shipping companies, run through the Development Finance Corporation, or the DFC. And this brings me back to my opening thought. Wait, isn't insuring cargo ships usually the job of the private sector, like Lloyd's of London? Why is the U.S. government acting like a neighborhood watch offering car insurance?
Well, it is the private sector's job under normal circumstances, but when a vital global choke point like the Strait of Hormuz becomes an active conflict zone or the site of a blockade, the actuarial math completely breaks down.
The risk is just too high.
Right. Private insurers cannot quantify the risk of a missile strike or a naval seizure. So the private insurance premiums skyrocket to a point where it becomes economically unviable for shipping companies to move their cargo.
Oh, I see. The cost to insure the ship becomes higher than the profit of selling the goods on the ship, so the ships just drop anchor and stop sailing.
Precisely. And if the ships stop sailing, the global supply chain collapses. Factories don't get parts, grocery stores don't get food, and inflation goes hyper. So the U.S. government steps in to absorb that unquantifiable geopolitical risk. By using the DFC to offer $40 billion in reinsurance, the government is backstopping the market. They're artificially lowering the insurance premiums so that the moment the Strait of Hormuz is permanently reopened, vessels can start moving immediately. They don't have to wait months for private insurance markets to settle down.
So they're acting as the ultimate insurer of last resort to protect the broader global economy. That is fascinating. But, global trade and naval blockades weren't the only international issues brought up in that room.
Oh, definitely not.
No. In fact, the Q&A portion of the briefing gave us a whiplash-inducing look at the chaotic information ecosystem of 2026. The press corps had their own agenda.
Yeah, the transition from the dense mechanics of maritime reinsurance to the rapid-fire questions from the press was incredibly jarring.
It really was. Let's just look at the sheer juxtaposition of what was asked. First, a reporter brings up an absolute geopolitical earthquake. They asked the press secretary about 10 American scientists who have allegedly gone missing or died since mid-2024. And we aren't talking about botanists here. These are scientists who reportedly had access to highly classified nuclear or aerospace material.
And what was staggering was the press secretary's notably non-committal response to that. I mean, she stated she hadn't spoken to the relevant agencies about it yet, and said that if true, it's certainly something the administration would deem worth looking into.
Yeah.
A potential targeted assassination campaign or defection ring involving American nuclear scientists was essentially treated as just another bullet point to circle back on.
It's wild.
Yeah.
And it gets crazier. Literally in the next breath, the room pivots to partisan mudslinging. A reporter brings up a recently published scandalous video of former Representative Eric Swalwell in a Las Vegas bed, asking about his ties to Senator Ruben Gallego.
Just a complete 180.
Right. And again, we aren't here to validate political gossip, but it is surreal to observe a press room where a terrifying nuclear security question shares the exact same oxygen and urgency as a question about a politician's Vegas hotel room.
And then, incredibly, it shifts to the absurd. Another reporter seriously asks if the president genuinely believes a joke he made, that because diet soda kills grass, it must also kill cancer cells.
I can't even.
The press secretary essentially had to roll her eyes and tell the room to get a better sense of humor.
But just as you think the briefing has devolved into total nonsense, we get hit with a massive macroeconomic shockwave. A reporter asks about $127 billion in tariff refunds that importers are requesting.
Yeah, this was the hidden landmine in the Q&A. This stems from a recent Supreme Court ruling that declared certain tariffs levied by the government to be illegal.
So let's dig into this, because $127 billion is a staggering amount of money. How does an illegal tariff refund actually work mechanically?
Okay, so when a tariff is applied, the foreign country doesn't pay it. The American importing company pays the tax to Customs and Border Protection when the goods arrive at the port. But that importing company doesn't just eat the cost, they pass that cost on to the American consumer through higher prices at the store.
Right, if a TV costs more to import, the price at the electronics store goes up.
Exactly. But now that the Supreme Court has ruled those specific tariffs illegal, the government has to refund the money. But the refund doesn't go back to the everyday consumer who actually absorbed the higher price.
Oh, man.
The refund check goes to the importing corporations who initially paid the fee at the port.
Wow. So $127 billion is about to be injected directly back into the balance sheets of these importing corporations.
Yes. And the Treasury Secretary quickly deflected the question, stating that the refund process is handled by Customs and Border Protection, not the Treasury. But think about the macro implications of that. That is a massive capital outflow.
Yeah.
And depending on how those corporate supply chains are structured, a significant portion of that $127 billion could be used to immediately purchase more goods from overseas, potentially flowing right back into the Chinese economy.
It is a profound economic shift, and it was discussed as a mere afterthought wedged between a diet soda joke and questions about the Middle East. It perfectly encapsulates how challenging it is to govern or even just stay informed when existential threats, massive capital outflows, and trivial gossip all collide within a 5-minute window.
But as chaotic and overwhelming as the present moment felt in that room, the administration did not let the briefing end on the defensive. They engineered a very deliberate pivot to the future, to legacy.
Which brings us to the monumental finale of the day. The administration used the close of the briefing to announce something entirely structural and deeply symbolic for America's 250th birthday in July 2026. They announced the submission of plans for the United States Triumphal Arch.
It is a fascinating and highly specific architectural choice.
Right. The renderings they passed around depict a 250-foot-tall masterpiece. It's slated to be built in Washington, D.C., on a currently empty green space at Memorial Circle on Columbia Island, which is a man-made island right in the Potomac River. The press secretary described it as a monument featuring artwork that depicts the success of the American people and the enduring triumph of the American spirit over the last 2.5 centuries.
But if you look at history, triumphal arches are rarely just about celebrating a birthday. I mean, from the Arch of Titus in Rome to the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, which was commissioned by Napoleon after his victory at Austerlitz, these monuments serve a very specific psychological purpose.
How so?
Empires and nations build massive, immovable structures of stone during periods of intense geopolitical stress or profound economic transition.
Oh, it's a way of projecting permanence when everything else feels volatile.
Exactly. When the world is chaotic, building a 250-foot arch is a way for a government to physically cement its narrative of strength, victory, and endurance directly into the skyline of the capital. It is architecture as a geopolitical tool.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive talking about the micro level, your $3,400 tax refund, removing the tax on your overtime, the Form 4547 seed money for your kids.
Yeah.
And we have ended with the literal macro level, a massive national monument being built in the Potomac.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, a unified theme emerges. The administration is attempting to project absolute strength and resilience on all fronts. Economically, they are deploying targeted tax cuts to forcefully drive an America-first reindustrialization.
Right.
Geopolitically, they are enforcing a unilateral blockade on Iran, threatening secondary sanctions on global powers like China, and absorbing the immense risk of global shipping through that $40 billion insurance backstop. And architecturally, they are casting that projection of dominance in stone.
But all of this projection, all of this strength, inherently relies on the American public's willingness to endure the intense friction that comes with these policies.
And that is the true vulnerability of the strategy. During the briefing, when the secretary was pushed on the very real pain Americans are feeling at the gas pump, the administration's core argument was that this is short-term volatility for long-term gain.
Yeah.
They are explicitly arguing that temporary, painful, high gas prices are a necessary sacrifice if the overarching strategic goal is preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
They are essentially asking the everyday American consumer to directly finance a global security operation through the increased cost of their daily commute.
Which tests the absolute limits of how much domestic economic pain a populace will tolerate for foreign policy objectives.
And that leaves us with a profound question for you to consider long after this deep dive ends. In our highly interconnected modern world, where exactly do everyday citizens draw the line? At what point does the personal economic pain, like paying a massive premium at the pump just to get to work, or watching inflation eat away at that $3,400 tax refund, outweigh your support for massive, abstract international security goals? It is an incredibly delicate balance between the money in your wallet and the stability of the global order. And as the world speeds toward the summer of 2026, it is a tension that is only going to pull tighter.